Senator Ted Cruz, author of a new book, A Time for Truth, is here. Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Well, good morning, Katie. Thank you for having me.
So I'm, of course, going to talk to you about running for president and, of course, your book, A Time for Truth, in a moment. But first, let's talk about the Supreme Court.
Sure.
Because you had a lot to say about the recent decisions. In fact, last week you described what happened at the court as, quote, some of the darkest 24 hours in our nation's history. Now, some people thought that seemed slightly hyperbolic, Senator Cruz. But in the grand scheme of things, why do you think that's the case?
You know, I've spent almost my entire adult life fighting to defend the Constitution. And what we saw last week in a series of two decisions on Thursday and Friday was twice in a row a majority of the Supreme Court violating their judicial oath. On Thursday, 6 justices rewrote Obamacare. They ignored the federal statutory text. And they stopped being, you know, you recall John Roberts at his confirmation hearing, he invoked an analogy of umpires calling balls and strikes. Well, they stopped being umpires calling balls and strikes. Instead, they joined a team. They put on bright blue Obama jerseys and they rewrote the law. And as a result, they are forcing this failed law on millions of Americans who've lost their jobs, who've lost their health care, who've lost their doctors because of Obamacare. And then the next day, on Friday, 5 unelected judges decreed that the marriage laws in all 50 states had to allow gay marriage, and that was fundamentally illegitimate. It was judicial activism. Reasonable minds can differ on the policy question of gay marriage, but there's nothing in the Constitution that demands that we tear down the marriage laws of every state. Listen, on that question, I agree very much with Justice Scalia, who said those decisions are a threat to our democracy.
We'll talk about those decisions in a bit more detail in a moment, but you tweeted this weekend that you're proposing an amendment to the Constitution to subject Supreme Court justice to periodic judicial retention elections. Now, others throughout history have called for this. Teddy Roosevelt, or something along these lines, called for a people's veto when he thought the decisions from the High Court were too conservative. But it never really happens. Is this more of a symbolic gesture on your part? Because I know that it has to be proposed by a vote of 2/3 of both houses of Congress and ratified by 3/4 of state legislators. Legal experts we spoke to said this will never in a million years happen. So is this really more of a statement?
No, and there's another way it can be proposed. It can come from the states, what's called an Article 5 Convention of the States. And we're seeing a growing movement pushing for that because people are so frustrated with what I call the Washington cartel. You know, in my book, A Time for Truth, what I endeavor to do is shine a light on what's happening in Washington. I began my career, as you know, as a law clerk at the U.S. Supreme Court, and I spent north of a decade litigating in front of the Supreme Court. So there are several chapters talking about the United States Supreme Court, what happens behind the scenes, what happens at the court. And then in Washington, I endeavor to do the same thing, which is shine a light on what happens behind the scenes. If you've ever wondered what happens when Republican senators are meeting 3 days a week for lunch in the backroom deals, what this book does is shine a light on them. And the sad reality is that there is what I call the Washington cartel. It's career politicians in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, who get in bed with lobbyists and giant corporations. And this is what people are so frustrated about. No matter who is elected, Washington, big government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The rich get richer and richer and richer. And hardworking Americans, our lives get harder and harder.
Let's go back to the Supreme Court, and then we'll talk more about sort of the atmosphere in the nation's capital. But on Thursday, you called, on the floor of the Senate, you called the justices of the Supreme Court who upheld Obamacare, quote, rogue justices and robed Houdinis, including Chief Justice Roberts. But in your book, you call him an extraordinary advocate with immense credibility. So where do you think he went wrong?
Well, listen, I've known John Roberts for 2 decades. He's a friend of mine. We were both clerks for Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Indeed, when Chief Justice Rehnquist passed away, both John Roberts and I were pallbearers at Chief Justice Rehnquist's funeral. I have long been a big fan of Chief Justice Roberts, and I will say his decision on Thursday and his decision 3 years ago, twice he has participated in rewriting Obamacare. And he is such a talented lawyer and judge that he knows exactly what he's doing. 3 years ago, what he did, the statute defined the individual mandate as a penalty. And the Supreme Court basically took out an eraser, erased the word penalty, and turned it into a tax. Now, you'll recall when President Obama was fighting for Obamacare, he repeatedly told the American people, this is not a tax. Well, the Supreme Court said it was, and then just this last week, he rewrote another portion of the statute, and it's...
So why do you think he's doing this, Senator?
I think it's politics. I think the Chief Justice believes somehow that by rewriting Obamacare, he's keeping the Supreme Court out of politics, but sadly, these will go down in his legacy as the most political decisions he's ever made, and it is violating his oath of office. It was heartbreaking and depressing 3 years ago when he did it, and he was every bit as heartbreaking last week.
I know that you have said that every GOP candidate running for president should want to repeal Obamacare, or they shouldn't be running at all, something along those lines. But what about the 16.4 million people who have health insurance now because of the President's Affordable Care Act? What about those people? What would you say?
Well, that figure is a deceptive figure. The large chunk of that are people that have been put on Medicaid. And one of the things about Medicaid, if you look at the health outcomes on Medicaid, health outcomes are markedly worse when people get on Medicaid. Medicaid is not performing well, and in fact, people's life expectancy goes down on Medicaid. It is markedly worse. And beyond that, there are some people who have purchased private insurance, but you got to remember, roughly 6 million people had their insurance canceled because of Obamacare. The president, as you'll recall, promised the American people, if you like your health insurance, you can keep it.
But it's still a net gain, is it not?
It's not at all. If the federal government forces your insurance company to cancel your insurance, millions of people have gone on the exchange, have purchased insurance that is more expensive, that covers less, their deductibles are higher, their co-pays are higher. You know, I'll point out a simple test here, Katie. You know, 5 years ago when Congress was debating Obamacare, President Obama promised the American people, he said under Obamacare, the average family's health insurance premiums will go down $2,500 a year. In fact, the average family's premiums have gone up $3,000 a year. Here's what I've suggested. Every family in America whose premiums have gone down $2,500 a year, you should vote for Hillary Clinton. I'll take everybody else. We've never had a presidential election decided 100-0. But this is a law that was sold to the American people under false pretenses. Remember, Jonathan Gruber, the architect of Obamacare, said that the only way it was sold was depending on what he called the stupidity of the American people. I think it's wrong when our elected leaders are lying to the American people and treating us like we're stupid.
Did John Roberts, in your view, redeem himself with his opposition to gay marriage?
Look, I'm glad that he followed his oath and honored the Constitution in one of the two decisions. He should have done it in both. Being a Supreme Court justice is not a part-time commitment to be faithful to the Constitution. It's all the time.
Justice Kennedy said the issue before the court here is the legal question whether the Constitution protects the right of same-sex couples to marry, adding the Constitution grants them that right. So is this a case of justices just having differing interpretations of the Constitution?
No, this is a case of justices literally making it up. The entire premise of this is that when the American people in 1868 ratified the 14th Amendment, that we were somehow silently and unawares striking down the marriage laws of every state. That is a preposterous statement.
But that was a very, very different time. I mean, do you not believe, Senator, that the Constitution is a living, breathing document?
Absolutely not.
So you're clearly a strict constructionist, but other people are judicial activists. And can't you agree to disagree?
See, but actually your question there, Katie, was exactly right. You're right. Other people are judicial activists. The definition of judicial activists are people who impose their policy preferences, their own personal policy preferences, instead of following the law and the Constitution. And you know, let me
But
point
might they not say, though, Senator, that changing times requires a different interpretation?
But that's not the law. And let me point out what Justice Scalia said in dissent. He said the impact of this decision is now 5 unelected lawyers, and let me point out, as he pointed out, these are all elite lawyers who went to Harvard or Yale. They are all but one from the East or West Coast.
Not Princeton and Harvard, as you did.
Listen, I went to Princeton and Harvard. I'll tell you, my father refers to my time up there as missionary work. And I guess I was too thick-headed to get the political indoctrinations those schools often beat into people's heads. But Supreme Court justices, you know, there's not a single Protestant on the court. The Supreme Court represents the elites.
There's 6 Catholics.
The Supreme Court represents the elites in New York and Washington, D.C. And what they're doing, as Justice Scalia said, it's 5 unelected lawyers who have declared themselves the rulers of 320 million Americans. And what I would point out, listen, Katie, I suspect you and I disagree as a policy matter on gay marriage. I suspect you're thrilled with the decision. But, you know, under the Constitution...
Really, it's irrelevant how I feel since I'm not running for president. So.
Well...
But I can tell you about the rest of the American people, though, Senator. 60% of the American people think gay marriage should be legal. 80% of Americans under 30 think it should be. So when it comes to this whole issue, I understand what you're saying about the constitutionality, if you have a point of view on that. But when it comes to this whole issue, are you afraid that you and other members of your party may, in fact, be out of step with the way the majority of Americans feel on this?
Katie, I'm not at all. You know, there's an old line that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. You know, with polls, there are a lot of pollsters who are seeking to get the results they want.
So you don't think attitudes about gay marriage have changed dramatically in this country?
Oh, look, of course attitudes have changed, and the media and Hollywood are doing everything they can to trumpet that. But let me point to 2 facts. 40 states have passed constitutional amendments or laws protecting traditional marriage as the union of one man and one woman. Just a few years ago, the state of California, not a conservative state, bright blue, Democratic California, they had a referendum, and the people of California voted to protect traditional marriage as the union of one man and one woman. There is a reason the Supreme Court stepped in last week, because the liberal elites don't want to follow the constitutional method. You know, there's a method under the Constitution. If you disagree as a policy matter with marriage, the way you're supposed to do it is convince your fellow citizens, go to state legislatures, and change their minds. That's the constitutional system. And that might well mean that the people of New York and the people of Texas or Florida come to different conclusions. That's the genius of our constitutional system. What we saw last week is 5 unelected lawyers said it doesn't matter what 320 million Americans think. We're going to decree this, and it wouldn't need to be a judicial decision rammed down the throats of the American people if the American people wanted it, because they can change it democratically, and yet this is inconsistent with both our Constitution and also with the values of the American people.
In an interview with the Texas Tribune this week, and you said that county clerks in Texas should absolutely be able to opt out of issuing same-sex marriage license if they have religious objections. But as state employees, don't they have an obligation to uphold the law of the land?
You know, the state does not have the right to force people to violate their religious faith.
Should they just quit then if they're not willing to do that?
You know, no, Katie, I don't think that the government should be driving Christians out of employment. I don't think they should be driving Orthodox Jews out of employment. I don't think they should be driving Mormons out of employment. I don't think we should see government manifesting a hostility to faith. And let me point out...
So how would this come to a head, Senator, if in fact, a clerk refuses to issue a same-sex marriage license? What would the recourse be, in your view?
You know, one of the things I describe in the book A Time for Truth is that I've spent 2 decades fighting to defend religious liberty, that this is not a campaign issue discovered upon launching a presidential campaign, that I have spent years and years. So when I was the Solicitor General of Texas, which is the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, over and over again, we defended religious liberty and won. We defended the 10 Commandments monument on the state capitol grounds, went to the Supreme Court, 1-5-4. We defended the Pledge of Allegiance, the words, one nation under God, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, won unanimously. And you know, when I was in private practice, I was very proud to have the opportunity to represent over 3 million veterans pro bono for free, defending the Mojave Desert Veterans Memorial. A lone white Latin cross was erected over 70 years ago to honor the men and women who gave their lives in World War I. The ACLU sued in California seeking to tear down that monument because it embraced the same thing you suggested right now, which is we should drive faith from the public square. If you're a Christian, just quit and don't work for government. Well, thankfully, representing 3 million veterans, we went to the Supreme Court and won 5-4. We're a nation that was built on protecting religious liberty.
So do you see this, pursuing this along legal lines, in fact, in the state of Texas, if these clerks so choose not to issue them?
I am eager to fight to defend religious liberty in every instance. Let me give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, I sat down with a couple in Iowa named Dick and Betty Odegaard. It's a delightful couple, an older couple, that a number of years ago, they purchased an historic Lutheran church, a beautiful old church that was built 70, 80 years ago. And they began hosting weddings in this church, and they started a business where they would cater the weddings. They started a flower shop. They'd provide flowers. And then a couple of years ago, 2 men came in and wanted to have a gay wedding there. And the Odegaards are devout Mennonites, and they explained, they said, listen, it is contrary to our faith. We can't host a wedding that our religious faith teaches us is wrong. The next day they were sued. They went through protracted litigation. The Odegaards had to write a $5,000 check to settle the litigation and promise never again to host a wedding. When I sat down 2 weeks ago with the Odegaards, they told me they're going out of business this summer. So their employees that had worked for them, they're having to lay them all off, and they're being persecuted for their religious faith. There is on the left an intolerance, whatever happened to tolerance and diversity, driving these people of faith out of business because they refuse to embrace something contrary to our faith. The First Amendment is protecting the right of you or me or all of us.
I guess if it trumps equality and fairness, I think that's when people have an issue with that.
But Katie, let me suggest, under the First Amendment, there is a reason religious liberty is the first protection in the First Amendment. Society has no right to force a Jewish rabbi to perform a Christian wedding ceremony. Society has no right to force a Muslim imam to perform a Jewish wedding ceremony. We are a nation, the history of this country. We were founded by people fleeing religious oppression and coming to a new land where every one of us could seek out God with all of our hearts, minds, and souls without government getting in the way, that we could live according to our conscience and our faith. And this decision last week is a profound threat to the religious liberty of millions of men and women who want to follow, whether they're Christians, whether they're Jews, whether they're Muslims, regardless of their faith, Catholics, Protestants, Mormons. This sets up the government going after those for whom faith is real. And that's wrong.
Let's move on to something a little more pedestrian, presidential politics. There are 13 Republicans running. Mitt Romney told me there's actually a bumper sticker that says, honk if you're not running for president.
That's pretty funny.
Why do you think you're the most qualified person in a very crowded field?
You know, I think the Republican primary is going to come down to one word, and that's trust. People are fed up with politicians who say one thing and do another. We've noticed, you know, in the Republican primary field, every candidate is going to tell the voters that they're super duper conservative. That's what they say. You don't get any candidate that ever goes in front of primary voters and says, I'm an establishment moderate. I don't stand for anything. I just go along to get along. They don't say that. You know, what this book talks about, A Time for Truth, is standing up to the Washington cartel. And I think Republican primary voters are going to ask two things. Number one, they're going to say of every candidate, don't tell me you're conservative. Show me. Show me where you've stood up and fought to stop Obamacare, to stop President Obama's unconstitutional amnesty, to defend religious liberty, to defend the Second Amendment, to stand with Israel. Show me your actual record. But secondly, Katie, I think Republican primary voters are going to ask, don't just tell me where you've stood up and opposed Obama. That's easy for Republicans to do, or at least pretend to do. Show me where you've stood up to the Washington cartel. Show me where you've stood up to leaders in your own party, in the Republican Party, and you've stood with the American people and the Constitution.
But it's not just about standing up, is it, Senator? Isn't compromise a necessary ingredient for governing? And you write in your book you're happy to compromise with Democrats, Republicans, independent, libertarians, even Martians, you say, if you had to. Give us a few examples of legislation you have actually worked with, reached across the aisle and worked with Democrats on, that had significant opposition, by the way, and that had to be really cobble together to come up with a compromise.
You know, one of the things that my book does is each chapter begins by featuring a truth teller, telling the story of someone who I admire, who I respect, who stood up in the face of long odds, told the truth, and paid a price. One of the people I feature may be a little surprising. It's Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from the state of New York. Now, Kirsten and I have become friends, and we worked together very, very closely. She has led the fight in the Senate, taking on sexual assault in the military. And she and I have done this together, working side by side to fight to change how sexual assault is handled in the military.
To take it out of the chain of command.
To take it out of the chain of command so that if a man or woman is facing sexual assault in the military, that the decision to prosecute will be made by a career military prosecutor. Now, I'll point out, both she and I standing together have fought our own parties. President Obama is leading the fight against Senator Gillibrand and my legislation, against changing the law in the military to protect against sexual assault. I think that's wrong. I disagree with President Obama, but I spent
many members of the military, obviously, like General Odierno, disagree with you and Senator Gillibrand as well.
Well, but let's be clear on that. Military leadership disagrees. The soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines do not disagree.
Right.
And yes, I recognize. And it's interesting, one of the things I describe in the book is how I came to the view, which is I went to a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing and had heard arguments on both sides and was listening to arguments on both sides. And Senator Gillibrand gave up an impassioned argument where she made 2 points that I think were very persuasive. One, for decades, military leadership, who I think in good faith has been trying to solve this problem, hasn't succeeded. And the data show sexual assaults are far too common in the military, and the primary reason they're not being reported is that the men and women are afraid they won't be handled fairly. But secondly, she pointed out, she said a number of our allies, such as Canada, Great Britain, Germany, Israel, have made this same change, and it hasn't impacted in a negative way good order and discipline. It's improved reporting rates. And I mentioned at that hearing, I said, you know, I came in with an open mind. I listened to the arguments. I was persuaded. And you'll be amused by this. A columnist from the New York Daily News came up to me afterwards. Said, were you telling the truth? Were you really persuaded by an argument at a hearing? I thought nobody ever listened to anything at these hearings, and everyone came in with their minds made up. And the next day, that columnist wrote a column that began, I think it was, hell froze over and pigs flew today. And a senator was persuaded in a Senate hearing. But Kirsten and I have worked together very, very closely.
Any other examples of compromise?
Sure. If you look on the foreign policy front, a little over a year ago, Iran named as its ambassador to the United Nations Hamid Abudulabi, who was a known terrorist who had participated in holding Americans hostage in 1979, 1980. And when they did so, it was intended to be, it was in fact a slap in the face to the American people. And yet everyone in Washington said there's nothing we can do to fix it. Well, I introduced legislation in the Senate to bar Abudulabi and other known terrorists from coming to this country. It got support from senators as varied as Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer. You know, when Senator Schumer gave a speech on the Senate floor praising that legislation, I went up to him, I said, you better be careful, Chuck, lightning's going to strike you. It passed the Senate 100-0. It passed the House 435-0. And President Obama signed it into law. 2 weeks later, the president was speaking at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And, you know, it's one of these dinners, politicians are supposed to get up and try to be funny. And President Obama said, a couple of weeks ago, Ted Cruz introduced legislation that I signed into law. And he said, here's a picture of the signing ceremony. He put up a picture of him, a picture of me, and the devil in hell freezing over. But that was a great example of working across the aisle in a bipartisan way to solve problems. And that is something that I have endeavored to do over and over and over again.
We have a lot to get to. I mean, I know the latest Fox poll has you at 4%, yet you were the first Republican to declare you were running for president, I guess, back in March. Why do you think your candidacy hasn't gotten more traction? Donald Trump is 11%.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. The media like to focus on national polls. I think national polls are almost entirely irrelevant. If you look back in prior cycles, for a year, Rudy Giuliani led every national poll by double digits. He won 0 states. I'll tell you, the energy and enthusiasm we're seeing is incredible. You know, when we launched the campaign, Heidi and I went on a barnstorming tour. We went to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Every place we went was standing room only. The local press reported the crowds coming out for us were much larger, in many instances double the size of any other candidate, double Jeb Bush, double Scott Walker. Just a few weeks ago, we were in New Hampshire. We had 600 people at a town hall in New Hampshire. New Hampshire's a small state. You don't get 600 people. The next day, we were in Massachusetts. The People's Republic of Massachusetts had 650 people come out. What we're seeing on the ground is incredible, and I'll tell you, Katie, another indication of that. In the couple of months since our campaign has launched, over 100,000 people have gone to tedcruz.org, have contributed online, have volunteered. We raised more in the opening week of our campaign than any Republican candidate in modern history, and it came, 95% of that came from contributions $100 or less.
You were born in Canada. Do you think that's going to be an issue for voters? Because when we did solicit questions on Twitter, many people pointed that out. I know your mother is a U.S. citizen, was a U.S. citizen when you were born, but people seem to have a problem with that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The whole birther thing was started by the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2008 against Barack Obama. And I recognize that there are folks online that like to push that issue. I'll tell you, as a legal matter, the law is quite clear that the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad is a citizen by birth, is a natural-born citizen. My mother was born in Wilmington, Delaware. I was born in Canada, in Calgary, because my parents were working in the oil and gas industry. And under federal law, the child of a U.S. citizen, if you or I travel abroad and we have a child abroad, that child is a citizen by birth. And it's actually come up multiple times in history. So, for example, John McCain was born in Panama, but he was a citizen by birth because his parents were American citizens. George Romney, Mitt's dad, who ran for president in '68, he was born in Mexico. His parents were Mormon missionaries.
So you're basically saying you don't believe it's an issue at all?
I think there will be some politically who try to push it as an issue, but as a legal matter, it is quite straightforward. The third example, by the way, that's kind of interesting is Barry Goldwater, who was born in Arizona before Arizona was a state, but he was a natural-born citizen because his parents were citizens.
Speaking of Barry Goldwater, do you think it's possible to be too conservative, Senator Cruz, to be elected president?
You know, there is a line that is pushed by the consultants in Washington, which is that the only way to win for Republicans is to run to the middle. And yet, you know, I understand how that theory could make sense in the abstract, but the nice thing is we've tested it. Every single time Republicans run a candidate that is an establishment moderate, we lose. It doesn't work. When you run Democrat light, you know what happens? People prefer the real thing. And we have got to win. I think our country's in crisis. I'll tell you the reason I'm running because of my little girls, Caroline and Catherine, who are 7 and 4. And today, for the first time in history, a majority of Americans think our kids will have a worse life than we did. I think if we keep going down this road, we risk losing this country. And if you look to past elections, what we're doing doesn't work. You know, Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. What is abundantly clear, if Republicans nominate another candidate in the mold of a Bob Dole or John McCain or Mitt Romney, all good, honorable, decent men who I respect, but what they did didn't work. If we do it again, the same voters who stayed home in 2008 and 2012, the evangelical Christians and the Reagan Democrats, the blue-collar Catholics, will stay home again in 2016, and Hillary Clinton will be the next president. I think the way we win is, as Reagan said, paint in bold colors, not pale pastels, and bring together that old Reagan coalition, and that's what we're working very hard to do.
Let's go through a couple issues just real quickly, if we could, because we don't have a lot of time left. But climate change. I know that you've said that climate might be changing, but there's no convincing evidence changes are man-made. But multiple studies, as you know, Senator, in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that at least 97% of climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activities. Now, the Pope, in his first major encyclical, wrote, "Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it." So do all those scientists and the Pope have it wrong in your view?
let me start with you. You suggested something that I'd said, and that's not actually a quote I've said. So that
Okay,
is not something accurately
then,
attributed
all right,
to
then
me.
why don't you tell us your position?
And I'll mention that the stat about the 97% of scientists is based on one discredited study. Let me tell you what my view is.
NASA has quoted that study, I know that.
And one of the sad things under President Obama is NASA has been politicized and has lost its core focus on space, instead pushing a partisan agenda.
Let's get back to climate change.
Well, I'm happy to. And my view on this and everything else is that we should follow the evidence and the science and the data. I'm the chairman of the Science and Space Committee of the Senate Commerce Committee. And I'm also the child of two mathematicians. Both my parents are mathematicians. My dad was a geophysicist for many, many years. And the problem with this debate is it is driven principally by people with partisan agendas in Washington that are disconnected from the science and the data.
What about the Pope?
And so let me talk about what the science and the data show. Satellite data show for the last 17 years, there has been no significant recorded warming. None. Now, that's a real problem because the whole basis of global warming alarmism was based on computer models that showed there was going to be significant warming. And the problem is the satellites, when they're measuring the temperature, it's not happening. And, it's interesting if you step back and look at it with some historical perspective. You and I both remember in the 1970s when there was a big push towards global cooling. We were told there was going to be a new ice age. And what happened, there were politicians who said the solution to global cooling was increased government control of the environment, of the economy, of energy in our lives. Well, the data didn't back that up. And so then the theory changed from global cooling to global warming. And interestingly enough, the solution was the same: more government control of the economy in our lives. But then the data didn't back that up. It wasn't, in fact, warming. So now it has changed into what is the perfect political pseudoscientific theory, which is climate change. Now listen, as the son of two scientists, the scientific method is you begin with a hypothesis, and then you test that hypothesis with evidence. You try to prove, is it true or false? Climate change is a perfect political theory because it can never be disproven. Whether it gets hot or cold, whether it gets wet or dry, no matter how it changes, it's always proven right. And the solution, yet again, is more and more government control of the economy in our lives. And I'll tell you who's being hurt.
So you don't think anything should be done?
I think this is driven by politicians that want more control over our lives.
But you think that the issue doesn't exist and should be ignored?
I think
I'm just trying to understand your position on it.
I think the data is driven by politicians who have always supported more government control. And let me tell you who's being hurt on this. It's interesting. The Democrats have made a very interesting political decision in the last few years. Barack Obama and Harry Reid and Hillary Clinton have chosen between two traditional favored children of the Democratic Party. They've chosen to go with the money from California environmentalist billionaires instead of the jobs of union members. Millions of union members are finding their jobs taken away. And I'll tell you what, I intend in this campaign to make a hard run. I think Republicans ought to be fighting for those union members because the Democratic Party has abandoned union members. The union bosses are going to stay with the Democratic Party in all likelihood, but our campaign is millions of hardworking men and women who want to work, who want to, energy gives us the opportunity to bring manufacturing, heavy manufacturing, the steel industry back to America. And the Democratic Party is more interested in money than they are interested in jobs.
So basically, I'm just trying to understand your position on climate change. You think that it is unproven, that it's happening, and that nothing should be done as a result. And you still didn't really give me your opinion about the Pope's encyclical.
Listen, I respect the Pope a great deal. He is a great theologian, and he has been speaking with great power, moving people to rediscover their faith. I commend him for that. In the world of public policy, I think we should follow the facts and the data. And I will note, getting back...
So he should have made the statements he made in the encyclical, in your view?
I think from the public policy perspective, we should follow the facts. And it's interesting. If you ask the American people, should a single mom who's working hard to feed her kids, you know what's happened in the last 6.5 years under the Obama administration? The rich have gotten richer. The top 1%, the millionaires and billionaires, the president always demagogues, today earn a higher share of our income than any year since 1928. The people who have been hammered are young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms. The people who've been hurt are people like my dad. And let's take a minute in the book to talk.
So what does that have to do with global warming? I'm sorry, are you saying that business has suffered because of our attention to that?
No.
I'm trying to understand the connection.
Actually, to be clear, big business does great with big government. The health insurance companies are making record profits under Obamacare. Giant financial companies. Remember Dodd-Frank was sold to the American people as stopping too big to fail? What do we see now? We see the big banks are even bigger. They're making record profits and small.
What do you do about income inequality then?
What you do is you create an environment where small businesses prosper. With big government, it's why I talk about the Washington cartel, where you have Republicans and big government Democrats both getting in bed, benefiting giant corporations at the expense of hardworking men and women. You know, Katie, I try to look at everything from the perspective of my dad. You know, my father was born in Cuba, and he fought in the Cuban Revolution. He was imprisoned. He was tortured in Cuba. And I spent a lot of time in the book telling his story as a teenager fighting alongside Fidel Castro and then coming to America. You know, one of the things I talk about in the book, A Time for Truth, is when he was standing on that ferry boat looking back at the dark prison cell where he had been tortured and looking forward to the Florida Keys and thinking about the land of opportunity that was America. When he began washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour, to pay his way through school, I try to think of every policy perspective from the view of how would have been impacted my dad. Let's take Obamacare.
Well, let's talk about immigration, because I'm very curious about your views on that. I know you staunchly oppose President Obama's executive actions on immigration. You've worked to block every legislative effort to allow undocumented immigrants to remain legally in this country. So given the fact that your father immigrated here from Cuba, do you have any empathy for people who come here looking for a better way of life? And is there a way to have some kind of comprehensive immigration reform? And what would you do with the 11 million people who are in this country illegally?
You know, Katie, on immigration, I am long-term optimistic and short-term pessimistic. I'm optimistic in the long term because outside of Washington, there's a lot of bipartisan agreement on immigration. I think there's overwhelming agreement outside of Washington that we've got to get serious about securing the borders, about solving the problem of illegal immigration. I represent the state of Texas. We've got nearly 2,000 miles of border. I've spent a lot of time down there. I've seen the bodies of the women and children left to die in the desert by the drug cartels. It is not humane or compassionate to continue our current system of not securing the borders.
But I think, in addition to securing the borders, though, Senator, I'm curious, what about the 11 million people who are here illegally? I know Jeb Bush has said, quote, yes, they broke the law, but it's not a felony. It's an act of love when he talks about families who come here illegally, trying to keep their families intact and feed their children. So is there some kind of common ground there?
Well, I'm trying to tell you where I think there's bipartisan agreement.
In addition to securing the borders.
I'm trying to tell you where there's bipartisan agreement. There's bipartisan agreement, number one, that we should secure the borders and solve the problem of illegal immigration. And there's also bipartisan agreement outside of Washington that we should streamline and improve legal immigration. As you noted, I am the son of an immigrant who came legally to the United States, and there is no stronger champion of legal immigration in the Senate than I am. And how do you actually pass immigration reform? How do you compromise, as you pointed out? You focus on the areas of bipartisan agreement. If we actually came together and crafted legislation that focused on common ground, we could pass that legislation. Now, why am I pessimistic in the short term? I'm pessimistic in the short term because I think Barack Obama and the Senate Democrats are not looking to solve this problem. They're focusing on the areas of greatest partisan disagreement. And the number one example is amnesty, a pathway to citizenship for those here illegally. And
so what would you do, Senator Cruz, with the approximately 11 million individuals who are in this country illegally? Would you deport them?
You know,
what would you do?
My view is you don't have to solve every aspect of this question all at once. I understand.
But what's your position on that?
But look, I understand that in the media, that's the only question you want to talk about.
That's not the only question, but it's one question, certainly.
But it is also the only question Barack Obama or the Senate Democrats talk about, and there's a reason for that. Because I think The Democrats are trying to use immigration as a partisan cudgel. And let me just point
But
something
you're
out.
running for president.
Yeah.
Don't you think people are entitled to know what you think and what you believe should be done with the 11 million people who are here illegally?
Katie, I'm perfectly happy to answer the question, but I'm going to answer it the way I'm answering it, even if you don't like that answer. And
I just would like you to tell me about you rather than discussing Democrats.
well, but let me point something out. For the first 2 years of President Obama's presidency, he had a majority in the House, a Democratic supermajority in the Senate. He could pass any legislation he wanted. It's when he rammed through Obamacare and Dodd-Frank. And he did nothing, zero on immigration. The problem right now, the reason why in the next 18 months nothing positive is going to get done on immigration is I don't believe President Obama wants to solve this problem. Now, how do we get something done? You talk about how you find common ground. You don't focus on the most divisive partisan issue. You focus where there's common ground. And so with respect to the people who are here illegally now, I don't think we have to solve everything all at once. I think we should pass...
So you would allow them to stay in this country?
No, I would pass legislation that secures the border, that puts real teeth. So you mentioned falsely that I had opposed everything on immigration. You had something like that. That's actually not true. I introduced quite a bit of legislation in the last Congress, including legislation to actually solve illegal immigration, to triple our Border Patrol, to increase fourfold the fixed wing and rotary wing assets, to put in place a strong biometric exit-entry visa system.
I said you blocked efforts to allow undocumented immigrants to remain legally in the U.S. Is that accurate?
Here's part of the problem on this issue, which is that the last time Congress passed immigration reform in the 1980s, Congress came to the American people and said, we have a deal with you. There were 3 million people who were living here illegally, and Congress told the American people, we're going to grant amnesty to these 3 million people. And in exchange, we're going to secure the border. We're going to solve the problem so illegal immigration goes away. And in the 80s, the American people said, okay, we accept the terms of that. Now, we know what happened. What happened was the amnesty happened, and the border never got secured. So today, instead of 3 million, it's 11 to 12 million. And what President Obama and the Senate Democrats and the Gang of Eight came to the American people with was the exact same deal, which is, we'll grant amnesty in exchange for securing the border. And the American people quite reasonably said, we don't believe you. You keep saying this, and you haven't demonstrated you can do it. So how do you solve the problem? You solve it one at a time. First, we come together, actually secure the border, improve and streamline legal immigration. And once we've demonstrated to the American people that we can secure the border, then I think we can have a conversation about what to do with whatever number of people remain here illegally. But until politicians demonstrate they'll do the first part, I don't believe the American people are interested in having that second part of the conversation, even though Democrats and many Republican members of the Washington cartel and all of the media, that's what they want to focus on.
Let's talk about ISIS, because I know we're about out of time. You have many things to do today, but I'm just curious how you would deal with ISIS. As we know, this past week, multiple attacks. We had Kuwait, Tunisia, France.
Yes. Heartbreaking.
If you were president, what would you do to get this problem of ISIS under control?
You know, one of the first things we need to start with is speaking the truth, as my book is entitled, A Time for Truth. One of the real problems is we cannot defeat radical Islamic terrorism with a president who's unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. In the book, I contrast a brave and courageous speech that Egypt's President al-Sisi, gave in January of this year at Cairo University, where he stood up as a Muslim and called out radical Islamic terrorists. And he called out to other Muslims and said, we need to lead the effort in targeting these jihadists who are murdering innocent people. Now, I got to say, for President al-Sisi to do that, that was a demonstration of courage. He was quite knowingly, there is no doubt that radical Islamic terrorists have targeted President al-Sisi for assassination. Because of that, one of the truth tellers I highlight is Anwar Sadat, who likewise spoke up against radical Islamic terrorism. And the sad thing is, Katie, President Obama refuses to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism.
So what, let me get back to the question though, Senator.
But I was answering the question.
What would you do forgetting how you describe this threat. How would you get it under control?
With respect, Katie, it's not forgetting. This is not simply a matter of semantics. Let me give you an example of what happens. In my home state of Texas, Fort Hood, over 5 years ago, 14 innocent souls were murdered by Nidal Hassan. And yet, the Obama administration refused to admit that was radical Islamic terrorism. Instead, they characterized it as, quote, workplace violence. You were asking about bipartisan legislative successes. One of the things I was very proud of is last year in the Senate, I introduced legislation in the Senate Armed Services Committee mandating that those 14 who were shot receive the Purple Heart. For 5 years, they'd been denied the Purple Heart. Now, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Obama Pentagon fought tooth and nail against that. I was very proud to get bipartisan support of both Democrats and Republicans. We passed it into law, the legislation I introduced, and as a result, just a few months ago, I went down to Fort Hood, and after 5 years, those soldiers who were murdered by a radical Islamic terrorist were finally acknowledged. It matters, and it matters because if you look at ISIS, without defining the enemy, our military strategy is not actually directed at solving the problem.
Okay, so let's say we call ISIS radical Islamic terrorists.
Okay.
What would you do to contain the threat?
I don't think we should contain the threat. I think we should defeat the threat.
What would you do to defeat the threat?
What we need is a commander-in-chief that lays out the objective for the military. We will destroy ISIS.
And how do you do that?
Now, there are a number of ways to do that. Number one, we can use overwhelming air power. Right now, the rules of engagement are so constrained that we're engaging in what I call photo-op foreign policy. We drop a bomb here, a missile there. We should be using overwhelming air power to take out ISIS. And then number two, the Kurds on the ground. The Kurds are longtime allies of America. They are the Peshmerga, which is the fighting forces of the Kurds, are very effective fighters. They're fighting ISIS right now, but ISIS has U.S. military equipment that they've seized from Iraq. The Obama administration refuses to fund the Kurds. The Kurds are using outmoded weaponry. We should be funding the Kurds and using the Kurds as boots on the ground.
Do you think the rules of engagement need to change as
Yes,
well?
absolutely.
That should there be more U.S. boots on the ground to fight ISIS, in your view?
You know, one of the problems with how politicians answer this question is the question of boots on the ground is treated as some talismanic question. So some politicians say absolutely boots on the ground to show that they're tough. Other politicians say no, never boots on the ground. I think that's the wrong approach to addressing military questions. The right approach is the commander-in-chief sets the objective. We will destroy ISIS. And then the military provides their expert judgment on how to carry it out. Let me give you an example of that, and it's why I started with defining the enemy. That's not just an abstract point. The military strategy all flows from defining the enemy to begin with. We didn't defeat the Soviet Union until President Reagan stood up and defined them as the evil empire and said our strategy was we win, they lose. Last year at the Senate Armed Services Committee, I asked the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I said, if the object were to destroy ISIS, not to weaken them, not to degrade them, but destroy them, what I've said since then is to make it, for anyone who joins ISIS, you're signing your death certificate. What would be required militarily to do that? And General Dempsey said, and I said, you know, if the object were to do that in 90 days, and General Dempsey said, I'm sorry, sir, that's simply impossible. I said, okay, General, perhaps that time frame is unreasonable. Perhaps 90 days is unreasonable. So you tell me what time frame and what would be required militarily to accomplish the objective. His response was, he said, there is no military solution to this problem. The only solution is to change the conditions on the ground, the underlying poverty, so that people are not attracted to radicalism. Now, with all respect to General Dempsey, that is nonsense. The answer is not expanded Medicaid in Iraq. The answer is taking out radical Islamic terrorists, the leaders of ISIS, before they succeed in waging jihad and murdering innocent Americans.
So in order to do this, is more U.S. manpower required, whether you call it boots on the ground, and should the rules of engagement about what those troops are empowered to do be shifted as well?
The rules of engagement should definitely change. In my visits with senior military leaders, I don't believe at this point a major ground offensive from U.S. troops is required. It may well, for that overwhelming air power. It may well require more embedded special forces to direct that air power. But I think the Kurds can serve as our principal boots on the ground. And they're fighting now.
And if that fails?
I think we should do whatever is necessary to protect this country. You know, on foreign policy, there are two poles. There's one which says, always intervene, always send the Marines. There's another poll that says, never intervene, withdraw from the world. I don't think the American people are at either end. In my view, we should never shy from defending this nation, from defeating radical Islamic terrorism, from preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, which the Obama-Clinton foreign policy is maddeningly facilitating. But the focus should always be tied to vital U.S. national security interest, and we should not be engaged in nation building. You know, I don't agree with the foreign policy decisions of the Bush administration. I think we got away from protecting our national security interest. It is not our object to turn foreign countries into democratic utopias. It is the job of the military to protect the lives of American men and women.
On that note, we'll have to end it there. Ted Cruz, your book is called A Time for Truth, Reigniting the Promise of America. Really appreciate your spending so much time with us. I hope your schedulers are not apoplectic back there, because I know you have a very busy day ahead, but we really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Katie. I've enjoyed visiting.
Thank you very much. And this has been a